It's time you lived on your own now, my daughter-in-law said calmly over coffee. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hesitate. She said it the way someone comments on the weather. My son sat beside her, staring into his cup, nodding slightly, as if this decision had already been made long before I arrived. I didn't answer. I wrapped my fingers around the mug, even though the coffee had gone lukewarm. I stood up, picked up my purse, and walked out of the cafe without saying a word. The next morning, I went to the bank. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story and let me know the city you're watching from. It helps me remember I'm not as alone as they thought. The cafe had been one of those quiet neighborhood places, the kind with soft music and chipped ceramic cups that never quite matched. My daughter-in-law had suggested it, saying she wanted to talk somewhere neutral. I had taken that as a good sign. Neutral meant calm, civil, family. I arrived early like I always do. Old habits are hard to break after a lifetime of being the one who waited. I sat by the window and watched cars pass, counting them without realizing I was doing it. By the time they arrived, my coffee had already cooled. She smiled when she saw me. Polite, measured, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. My son hugged me briefly, his arms stiff, his body already angled back toward his wife. They ordered their drinks. She didn't ask what I wanted. She already knew. We talked about small things at first. Traffic, the weather, a neighbor who had moved away. Ordinary words, carefully stacked to avoid anything real. Then she set her cup down, folded her hands and looked directly at me. That was when she said it. It's time you lived on your own now. She added words after that. Soft ones, reasonable ones. She talked about independence, about space, about what was best for everyone. She used the word we more than once. We think, we feel, we've decided. I looked at my son, waiting for him to interrupt her, to say my name, to say Mom. He didn't. He kept his eyes on the table, as if the wood grain suddenly required his full attention. The silence stretched. No one rushed to fill it. People at nearby tables laughed, spoons clinked against saucers, a barista called out an order. Life continued around us, unaware that something had quietly ended at our small corner table. I nodded once, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. I didn't argue. I didn't ask where I was supposed to go, or how this would work, or when they had started thinking of me as something that needed to be moved aside. I stood up, my knees protested, but I ignored them. I told them to enjoy their coffee. My voice was steady. That surprised even me. Outside, the morning air felt sharper than it had before. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder, grounding myself in the weight of it. Inside were my keys, my wallet, a folded receipt from the grocery store, proof that I still existed. They thought that conversation was the end of something. For me, it was the beginning of paying attention. The house felt different after the cafe, not empty, not quiet, just unfamiliar. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, setting my purse down on the small table by the entryway. The same table I'd used for years to sort mail, drop my keys, leave notes for my husband when he was still alive. Nothing had moved. And yet something had. I took off my coat slowly and hung it in the closet. My movements were deliberate, careful, as if rushing might make the walls collapse around me. The clock in the living room ticked steadily. I noticed it because no one was talking over it anymore. After my husband passed, the house had already learned how to be quiet. But this was a different kind of silence. This one felt intentional. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The sink was empty. No dishes, no mess. My daughter-in-law liked things clean and efficient. That had become more important over the years. More important than conversations, more important than comfort. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd helped my son with homework decades ago, where I'd served birthday cakes and holiday dinners. I ran my hand along the edge of the wood, worn smooth by time and use. My place was still there. The chair hadn't been moved, yet I could already feel it slipping away. Later that afternoon, my son came home. He greeted me politely, the way you greet a neighbour. He asked if I'd eaten. I said yes, even though I hadn't. He nodded, satisfied, and went upstairs. The door to his room closed softly behind him. We used to talk in the evenings, about work, about plans, about nothing at all. That night, there was only the sound of running water from the shower and the television murmuring in the background. I reheated leftovers for dinner and ate alone. I washed my plate immediately after, dried it and put it away. I didn't want there to be evidence that I was still taking up space. In the living room, a small stack of mail sat on the side table. Mixed in with grocery flyers and utility bills was an envelope addressed to my son. Inside, I already knew would be plans made without me. Appointments, numbers, decisions. No one said anything else about the cafe. No one followed up. No one asked if I was okay. That's how I knew it wasn't a suggestion. It was a conclusion. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling. I listened to the house settle, the pipes shifting, the faint hum of electricity behind the walls. I thought about all the years I'd lived here without ever questioning whether I belonged. In the morning, I woke early, earlier than usual. I made coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching the sun climb slowly over the rooftops. I didn't feel angry. I felt alert. There's a difference. By mid-morning, I had my coat on and my purse in hand again. I told my son I had errands to run. He nodded, distracted, already turning back to his phone. I drove to the bank, parked in the same spot I always used, and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. They thought I was being eased out. What they didn't realise was that I had finally started paying attention to where everything stood. Things began changing in small ways after that. Quiet ways, the kind you don't notice all at once. My son stopped asking where I was going when I picked up my purse. He used to. Even if it was just to the grocery store, he'd ask if I needed help carrying bags. Now he only nodded, already halfway back into his phone. My daughter-in-law started reorganising the house, not dramatically, just enough to make it clear that certain spaces were no longer mine. One afternoon, I came home to find my papers moved from the desk in the corner of the living room to a neat stack on the dining table. She said she was decluttering. Her voice was light, pleasant. The desk became her workspace the next day. I didn't say anything. I folded my papers, placed them in my bag, and carried them back to my room. The room I'd slept in for years now referred to as your room, the way you might talk to a guest. At dinner, conversations shifted. They spoke to each other across the table, their voices overlapping easily. When I tried to add something, the topic changed. Not abruptly, just enough that my words faded before landing anywhere. One evening, my daughter-in-law mentioned a timeline. She didn't explain it. She didn't need to. The word hung in the air like a calendar page already turned. I noticed she stopped buying foods I liked. The cereal I always ate in the morning disappeared. The tea I preferred was replaced with something stronger, something she liked. When I mentioned it once, she smiled and said, "Oh, I didn't think you drank that anymore." I did. I just hadn't mattered. My son began using phrases he'd never used before. "We'll see. We'll talk about it later. That's something we're handling." The word "we" created a quiet line I wasn't meant to cross. One afternoon, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. My name came up, followed by lowered voices. I didn't strain to hear. I didn't need to. Their tone told me enough. That night, I opened the closet in the hallway and noticed my coat had been moved to the far end. Her coats were front and centre, neatly spaced. My shoes had been shifted to the bottom rack. It wasn't hostility. It was preparation. I thought back to the cafe, to the way she'd said it, calmly, as if she were doing me a favour, as if this wasn't about space but control. I started paying closer attention to mail, to conversations that stopped when I entered the room, to the way my son deferred before answering simple questions, glancing at his wife first. I had lived long enough to recognise patterns. One evening, my son mentioned almost casually that a friend of his had helped his mother find a place better suited for her. He said it like it was a kindness, like it was something to aspire to. I smiled and nodded. Inside, something settled. Not sadness, not fear, clarity. They weren't pushing me away suddenly. They had been slowly removing me for a while. That night, I opened an old folder I kept at the back of my drawer. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years. Deeds, statements, letters signed by my husband, written in careful ink. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I read each page slowly, under the soft light of the bedside lamp, listening to the house breathe around me. They thought they were planning my exit. What they didn't know was that I was finally seeing the full picture. I thought about my husband more that week than I had in years. Not because I missed him more than usual, but because his absence explained everything. When he was alive, this house had weight. His presence filled rooms even when he wasn't speaking. Decisions were discussed, not assumed. Boundaries existed without being announced. I had never needed to defend my place because it was understood. After he died, things shifted slowly. At first, my daughter-in-law had been attentive. She checked on me, asked if I needed anything, told people how much she admired my strength. I believed her. That phase didn't last. I remembered a conversation from years ago, standing with my husband in the backyard while he fixed a loose board on the fence. He'd wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "No matter what happens, this house is yours. Promise me you'll never feel like a guest here." I had laughed then, told him not to be dramatic. He had looked at me for a long moment before nodding. Now, lying in bed at night, I replayed that moment over and over, not because it made me sad, because it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I wasn't temporary. The next morning, I noticed my daughter-in-law had placed a small basket near the stairs, labelled donation. Inside were items that hadn't been used recently. A scarf I liked, a throw blanket I kept on the couch. Nothing valuable, nothing worth arguing over. That was the point. She said it was to help me lighten my load. Her tone was warm, almost caring. I thanked her and carried the basket back into my room without comment. My son watched silently. He didn't stop her. He didn't look at me either. Later that day, I found myself standing in the garage, looking at old boxes stacked neatly along the wall. Some were labelled in my handwriting, others in my husband's. Tools, photo albums, paperwork we'd meant to sort one day. I opened one box and pulled out a framed photo of us from decades ago. We were younger then, tired, proud. The house behind us was half finished, but it was ours. We had built our lives piece by piece, without asking permission. I placed the photo back carefully and closed the box. That evening, my daughter-in-law mentioned she'd been looking at listings, apartments, senior communities, places with less maintenance. She spoke as if she were sharing a hobby. I asked how her day had been. She seemed surprised by the change in topic, then answered quickly. The conversation moved on. Inside, I made a quiet decision. I stopped explaining myself. When I went out, I didn't announce it. When I returned, I didn't justify where I'd been. I kept my papers organised. I kept my schedule to myself. I listened more than I spoke. People underestimate what silence can do when it's chosen. One afternoon, I drove past the old neighbourhood where my husband and I had first lived after getting married. The houses were smaller than I remembered, the streets narrower, but the feeling was familiar, grounded, earned. That night, I slept better than I had since the cafe. They believed this was about my future, about what I needed. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about where I would live. It was about who thought they had the right to decide. By the end of that week, the house began to feel like a schedule I wasn't included in. Meals happened without notice. I'd come into the kitchen and find dishes already washed, counters wiped clean, the smell of food still faint in the air. When I asked if they'd eaten, my daughter-in-law would smile and say, "Oh, we didn't think you'd be hungry yet." I learned to keep quiet. My son started leaving earlier in the mornings. When he came home, he was tired, distracted, already halfway through conversations I hadn't been part of. He spoke about plans in vague terms. Busy weekend. A lot going on. Nothing specific. Nothing for me. One afternoon, a delivery arrived while I was home alone. Large boxes, clean labels. I signed for them and left them by the wall, unsure where they belonged. When my daughter-in-law came home and saw them, she thanked me and said they were for the office setup. She didn't mean my office. She meant the desk that used to be mine. That evening, she assembled furniture in the corner of the living room. My desk was moved completely into the hallway, awkward and out of place. I helped by holding screws, passing tools. She thanked me politely, like you thank a neighbour. Later, I carried my desk into my room myself. That night, I overheard my son on the phone. His voice was low, cautious. He talked about timing, about not wanting things to be uncomfortable. He said my name once, then stopped and switched to she. I I sat on my bed and folded laundry slowly, shirt by shirt, towel by towel. I focused on the rhythm of it. Fold, stack, breathe. The next day, a pamphlet appeared on the kitchen counter. Senior living communities. Bright photos, smiling faces, walking paths and shared dining rooms. My daughter-in-law said she'd picked it up, just in case. I placed it neatly into a drawer without comment. She watched me for a moment, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. Then she turned away, slightly disappointed. That's when I understood something important. They needed me to resist. They needed tears, arguments, questions, something they could point to and call difficult. My silence gave them nothing to work with. So I stayed calm. I stayed observant. I noticed which bills came in my son's name, which accounts were still addressed to me. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law checked the mail before anyone else. I noticed she had started opening envelopes without asking. One morning, I found a document on the printer. Just one page. An estimate. Numbers listed cleanly at the bottom. I didn't read it fully. I didn't need to. The heading told me enough. They were planning ahead. That afternoon, I drove to the storage unit my husband and I had rented years ago. The one no one else remembered. I unlocked it and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of dust and cardboard. Everything was still there. Organised, waiting. I sat on a folding chair and opened another folder. More papers, more signatures, more proof than anyone realised. When I returned home, the house was quiet again. My daughter-in-law was on her laptop. My son was in another room. No one asked where I'd been. I smiled to myself as I went upstairs. They believed this phase was about easing me out gently. What they didn't know was that I was already 3 steps ahead, simply by staying quiet and watching everything unfold. By the following week, I understood my role clearly. I was expected to cooperate, quietly, gratefully. My daughter-in-law began phrasing things as favours. She reminded me about trash day, even though I'd managed it for years. She suggested I rest more. She offered to handle things that had once been mine without question. Each gesture was wrapped in concern, but the message underneath stayed the same. You don't need to be involved anymore. One morning, she mentioned she'd spoken to someone from a housing office. She said it casually, while scrolling on her phone, as if she were talking about a sale at the grocery store. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't ask what I thought. My son stood nearby, tying his shoes. He paused for half a second, then continued. That was all the confirmation she needed. I nodded and poured myself coffee. Later that day, I received a call from an old friend. We hadn't spoken in a while. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was fine. I always did. She hesitated, then said she'd heard I might be downsizing. The word made me smile. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, replaying that conversation. Information was travelling faster than I realised. Decisions were being discussed beyond these walls, without me. That night, I pulled out my calendar and began marking days, appointments I remembered, dates that mattered, small notes in the margins. I wasn't planning an escape, I was documenting reality. The next morning, I found another envelope on the counter, this one addressed to both my son and his wife. Inside was a letter from a financial advisor. I recognised the name immediately, someone my husband had trusted years ago. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I simply noted it. My daughter-in-law started speaking to me with a tone reserved for children and the elderly. Slower, louder, excessively patient. She asked if I'd remembered to take my vitamins and if I was comfortable driving it, and I answered politely every time. One afternoon while she was out, I sat in the living room and looked around. The walls were filled with photos, holidays, graduations, birthdays. In almost every one, I was standing slightly to the side, smiling, present, but never centred. I wondered when that had started. When my son came home, I asked him a simple question. Whether he was happy. He seemed startled. He said yes, of course. Too quickly. I told him that was good. That was all. He relaxed, relieved I hadn't asked anything harder. That evening, my daughter-in-law announced she'd scheduled a family meeting for the weekend. She said it would be good to talk about next steps. She smiled while saying it, confident, organised, already moving pieces into place. I thanked her for letting me know. In my room that night, I took out my husband's letters again. I read them slowly, one by one. His handwriting was steady, intentional. He'd been clear about what he wanted, even if others assumed otherwise. I slept soundly. The next day I made copies, not of everything, just enough. When the weekend arrived, I dressed carefully, not formally, not casually, just myself. I sat at the table before they joined me, hands folded, posture relaxed. They thought this meeting would be about my future. They didn't realize I had already stopped reacting and started preparing to speak, only when it mattered. The family meeting happened on a Saturday morning. My daughter-in-law had prepared for it carefully. The table was cleared, not a single item out of place. She placed a notebook in front of herself and my son as if minutes would be taken. I noticed there was nothing set out for me. No paper, no pen. I didn't ask for one. She began by talking about practical matters, about how life changes, about how people need different things as they get older. Her voice stayed calm, measured, professional. She spoke as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. My son nodded along. Occasionally, he added a word or two. Makes sense. We've thought about this. It's not easy, but they avoided saying the word move. Instead, they said transition, support, options. I listened. When she finally looked at me, she asked how I felt. The question sounded rehearsed, carefully placed like a checkbox at the end of a form. I told her I understood. That surprised her. She blinked, then continued. She talked about timelines again, about looking at places within the next few months. She mentioned selling some furniture to make things easier. She said she'd help me pack when the time came. When she finished, she folded her hands and waited. I didn't speak right away. I looked around the table instead, at the grain of the wood, at the faint scratch near the edge where my husband had once dropped a tool, at the chair my son sat in, the same one he'd used as a teenager, slouching through dinners, complaining about homework. I thought about how quickly roles change when people think they're in charge. I thanked them for being concerned. My son exhaled, relieved. My daughter-in-law smiled, pleased that things were going smoothly. That was when I realized something important. They had mistaken my calm for agreement. After the meeting, my daughter-in-law became more confident. She started mentioning dates out loud, maybe early spring. Before summer, ideally. She spoke as if decisions had already been finalized. I continued my routines. I cooked when I wanted to. I cleaned up after myself. I came and went without explanation. I kept my door closed more often. At night, I reviewed my notes, not in a rush. I compared dates. I cross-checked names. I made sure I understood exactly what was written and what wasn't. One afternoon, my son asked if I needed help with anything. His voice was cautious, uncertain. I told him no, that I had everything under control. That made him uncomfortable. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, seemed reassured. She liked things predictable, quiet, compliant. She didn't notice when I stopped leaving my papers out. She didn't notice when certain documents disappeared from the drawer. She didn't notice when I started carrying a slim folder with me instead of leaving it behind. She was too busy planning the end of a chapter she assumed was already closed. One evening, she brought up the idea of changing the locks once everything was settled. She said it casually, as if it were obvious. My son laughed awkwardly. I smiled politely. Inside, I made a note. That night, I sat at the edge of my bed and thought about all the times I had stepped back to keep the peace. All the moments I had chosen silence so others could be comfortable. This time was different. I wasn't staying quiet because I was weak. I was staying quiet because I was ready. They believed the process was moving forward exactly as planned. What they didn't understand was that I had reached the point where silence stops being passive and becomes a decision. The first crack appeared on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. My daughter-in-law had gone out. My son was at work. The house belonged to no one for a few hours, which meant it belonged to the truth. I was sorting mail at the kitchen table when I noticed an envelope I hadn't seen before. It wasn't sealed, just tucked beneath a stack of flyers, as if someone had meant to come back to it later and forgotten. The return address caught my eye. I didn't rush. I finished sorting the rest of the mail first. I threw away what didn't matter. I stacked what did. Only then did I open the envelope. Inside were copies of documents, not originals, cleanly printed, carefully prepared, names, numbers, dates. They were discussing assets, not my comfort, not my care, assets. I recognized some of the account numbers immediately. Others I didn't. That didn't matter. What mattered was how familiar the structure looked, the phrasing, The assumptions. I had seen versions of this before, years ago, when my husband and I sat across desks and made plans together, except this time my name was missing from the conversation. I folded the papers neatly and slid them back into the envelope. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. That evening, my daughter-in-law came home in a good mood. She chatted about her day, about traffic, about a sale she'd found online. She moved easily through the kitchen, confident, comfortable. At one point, she mentioned paperwork, casually, said things were progressing. She watched my face carefully when she said it. I smiled and asked if she wanted help with dinner. Her shoulders relaxed. Later that night, I took out my own folder, the one I'd kept hidden for years, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. Inside were documents my husband had insisted we keep copies of. Deeds, statements, notes in his handwriting. I laid them out on the bed and compared them slowly, one page at a time. Not looking for drama, looking for alignment. That's when I saw it clearly. They were working from assumptions that weren't accurate. They believed certain things had been transferred. They hadn't. They believed decisions had been finalized. They weren't. They believed I had less standing than I did. That belief made them careless. The next day, I made 2 phone calls. Brief, polite, no explanations given. Just questions asked and answers confirmed. By the time I hung up, my hands were still steady. At dinner, my son mentioned the upcoming timeline again. He spoke as if it was settled. I nodded and passed the salt. My daughter-in-law smiled at him, satisfied. I noticed she had started keeping her laptop closer, locking the screen when she stepped away, moving faster when paperwork was involved. Confidence often turns into urgency when people sense something shifting. That night, I slept deeply, not because I felt safe, because I felt prepared. In the days that followed, I paid attention to how often they spoke in whispers, how often my name appeared, followed by pauses, how my daughter-in-law checked her phone more frequently, frowning when messages didn't come quickly enough. She was waiting for something to finalize. What she didn't realize was that the ground beneath her plan wasn't as solid as she thought. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't reveal what I knew. I continued being calm, agreeable, predictable. Silence works best when it looks the same as before. They believed the truth was on their side because they'd never been challenged. They didn't know I had already seen the full picture, and that once you see it, you don't panic. You wait, and you choose the moment carefully. The dinner that night was planned, not announced, planned. My daughter-in-law cooked a full meal, meat, vegetables, dessert, the kind of dinner meant to signal normalcy, stability, family. She set the table carefully, aligning the plates, adjusting the napkins until everything looked balanced. I arrived last and took my seat without comment. My son talked more than usual about work, about a project that might turn into a promotion. He laughed at things that weren't especially funny. My daughter-in-law watched him closely, nodding at the right moments, touching his arm when he spoke. They were relaxed. That told me something. People only relax when they believe the outcome is secure. Halfway through the meal, my daughter-in-law brought up spring again. She mentioned how quickly time passes, how nice it would be to have things settled before summer. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. I chewed slowly and listened. She talked about furniture that could fit where, what might be easier to sell. She used words like practical and sensible. She framed everything as a favour, as help. My son nodded along, his mouth full, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me, then away again. I noticed he didn't say my name once. At some point, she asked if I'd thought about places yet. Her tone was gentle, rehearsed. She smiled, waiting. I set my fork down and dabbed my mouth with my napkin. "I've been thinking," I said. They both leaned in slightly. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then I added, "About timing." My daughter-in-law's smile widened. She reached for her glass. My son exhaled, relieved. "That's good," she said. "We just want what's best for you." I nodded. The rest of the meal passed easily after that. Dessert was served. Coffee was poured. My daughter-in-law laughed, lighter than she'd been all week. The tension she'd carried so carefully seemed to dissolve. She thought the conversation had gone her way. After dinner, I cleared my plate and washed it immediately. I dried it and put it away. I didn't leave it in the sink. I didn't leave a trace. As I walked past the living room, I noticed my daughter-in-law's notebook on the coffee table, the same one from the meeting. It was open to a page filled with neat handwriting, dates circled, notes in the margins. I didn't stop. I didn't look closer. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle. I thought about how confident she'd sounded, how easily she'd spoken about rearranging my life, how sure she was that I would follow the path she'd outlined. Confidence can be blinding. The next morning, my daughter-in-law left early. My son followed shortly after. The house fell quiet again. I made myself breakfast and ate slowly. Then I went to my room and retrieved the slim folder I'd been carrying with me. I reviewed the documents one more time. I checked names, I checked dates, I checked signatures. Everything was still exactly as I remembered. I placed the folder back into my bag and zipped it closed. Later that afternoon, my phone rang, a number I recognized but hadn't saved. I answered calmly. Yes, I said. Yes, I understand. Yes, that will work. When I hung up, I didn't feel nervous. I felt settled. They believed that dinner had been a turning point, that I was easing into acceptance, that the next steps would follow smoothly. They didn't realize that while they were celebrating progress, I had already chosen when to stop listening and when to finally speak. The moment arrived without ceremony. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a quiet afternoon and a table cleared of distractions. My daughter-in-law had asked for another conversation. She said it would be brief. My son sat beside her again, hands folded, posture careful. They both looked prepared, papers stacked neatly in front of them, confidence settled in their shoulders. They believed this was the final step. She began by summarizing everything they'd already said, the timeline, the options, the arrangements she'd researched. She spoke smoothly, efficiently, like someone presenting a plan she expected to be approved. My son nodded along. He added a few words about wanting me to be comfortable, safe, taken care of. I listened until she finished. Then I reached into my bag. The movement was small, deliberate. I placed my folder on the table between us. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit there, plain and unassuming. My daughter-in-law paused just for a moment. I brought something too, I said. Her smile faltered slightly, then returned. She assumed it was paperwork related to moving. She leaned back in her chair, relaxed. I opened the folder and slid one document forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for them to see the names. My son leaned in first. His brow furrowed as he read. My daughter-in-law followed, her eyes scanning faster, her posture stiffening almost immediately. I said nothing. The room felt smaller. I placed a second document beside the first, then a third, each one confirming the same thing from a different angle. Ownership, authority, decisions that had already been made years ago, quietly, carefully, without room for interpretation. My daughter-in-law cleared her throat. She started to speak, then stopped. She tried again. That must be outdated, she said. I shook my head once. My son looked up at me then. Really looked. His expression shifted from confusion to something closer to recognition. You knew? He asked. I remembered, I said. Silence followed. Not awkward. Heavy. My daughter-in-law reached for her notebook, flipping pages quickly, searching for something to counter what was now sitting plainly in front of her. Her confidence drained with every page she turned. This changes things, she said carefully. Yes, I replied. It does. I didn't accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances or explain how I'd felt over the past weeks. I didn't need to. Facts have a way of speaking clearly on their own. My son leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He looked tired, older than he had a month ago. I thought, he began, then stopped. My daughter-in-law straightened, forcing her composure back into place. She asked questions, technical ones, about dates, about intent, about next steps. I answered only what was necessary. When the conversation ended, there were no resolutions reached, no decisions finalized, no smiles exchanged. They had expected closure. What they got instead was uncertainty. As I gathered my papers and slid them back into my bag, my daughter-in-law watched me closely, not with irritation, with calculation, reassessment. The balance had shifted. I stood up, adjusted my coats and thanked them for their time. My voice was calm, even. As I walked away, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet certainty. They had spent weeks planning my exit. I had spent the same time waiting for the moment when truth, placed gently on the table, would do the work for me. After that conversation, the house changed again. Not suddenly, subtly. My daughter-in-law stopped mentioning timelines. The word disappeared from her vocabulary overnight. She no longer spoke about spring or summer or next steps. Instead, she filled the silence with small talk. Harmless things. Weather, errands, television shows. My son became quieter. He started coming home later, often sitting alone in the living room instead of joining his wife in the kitchen. He asked me questions again, small ones at first, whether I'd eaten, whether I needed anything from the store. The concern in his voice felt unfamiliar, almost tentative. I answered no more, no less. My daughter-in-law watched this shift carefully. I could see it in the way her eyes followed him, in how she adjusted her tone when speaking to me. She was recalculating, revising. The confidence she'd worn so easily had been replaced by caution. One afternoon, she approached me while I was folding laundry. "I didn't realize things were so complicated," she said. Her voice was softer than usual, controlled. I looked up at her and nodded once. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't explain. That seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have. Later that week, my son asked if we could talk, just the two of us. We sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the same place where decisions had been made without me. He told me he hadn't known, that he'd assumed, that he'd trusted. His words came slowly, unevenly, as if he were choosing each one carefully. I listened. When he finished, I said I understood, not because I agreed with everything he'd done, but because I knew how easily people drift when someone else does the thinking for them. He asked what I wanted now. I told him I was comfortable where I was. That answer surprised him. My daughter-in-law became more distant after that, not cold, just reserved. She stopped offering help, stopped rearranging. She kept her things close and her plans quiet. The pamphlets disappeared. The notebook stayed closed. At dinner, conversations grew cautious. No one made assumptions out loud anymore. No one spoke as if my future were a shared project. The balance in the house had shifted and everyone could feel it. One evening, I overheard my son on the phone again. His tone was different this time. Firm. He asked questions. He pushed back. He ended the call quickly. When he saw me in the hallway, he hesitated, then nodded. Not apologetically. Respectfully. That was new. I continued my routines. I came and went freely. I kept my folder in my bag, though I no longer needed to check it. The knowledge of what it contained was enough. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stops being challenged. My daughter-in-law began speaking to me as an equal, careful, measured. She chose her words thoughtfully now, aware that I was listening. The house felt steadier, not warmer, but balanced. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for emotions. What they hadn't prepared for was the quiet recalibration that happens when someone realizes they misjudged the person sitting across the table. I didn't take anything from them. I simply reclaimed what had always been mine, my place, my voice, and the right to decide when to use it. The house didn't return to what it had been before. It became something else, quieter in a different way, not tense, not expectant, just settled. No one talked about moving anymore. No one brought up timelines or options or what might be easier. My name was spoken again, not as a problem to solve, but as a person in the room. I noticed the change in small moments. My son waiting for me before starting dinner. My daughter-in-law asking instead of deciding. The desk in the living room left untouched. One morning, I found my old scarf folded neatly on the chair where I used to sit. It hadn't been placed there dramatically, just returned. Quietly. I didn't comment on it. Weeks passed. Life continued. I kept my routines. Morning coffee by the window, short walks in the afternoon, sorting mail at the same kitchen table where so much had shifted. One evening, my son sat with me after dinner. No agenda, no tension. He told me about his work, about things he was unsure of. I listened the way I always had. At one point, he stopped and said, "I'm glad you're here." He didn't say it loudly. He didn't repeat it. That was enough. My daughter-in-law remained careful, but no longer strategic. Her politeness softened into something more genuine, not warmth, respect. That mattered more. I never brought the folder out again. It stayed where it belonged, untouched. Not because it wasn't important, but because it had already done its job. Power doesn't need to be displayed once it's understood. Sometimes in the evenings I think back to that cafe, to the way she'd said it. calmly, over coffee, as if she were closing a chapter for me. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I wouldn't tell her to argue. I wouldn't tell her to defend herself. I would tell her to listen, because silence gave me time. Time gave me clarity, and clarity gave me my place back. I didn't stay because I won a confrontation. I stayed because I remembered who I was, a woman who had built a life here, a woman who had raised a son, a woman who didn't disappear just because someone else decided she should. Now, when I sit in this house, I don't wonder where I belong. I know, and that knowledge is quiet, steady, unshakable. They once thought it was time for me to live on my own. What they never understood was this: I always had.